History as it happens, July 27th, 2023. George's farewell.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear.
Execute the office of President of the United States.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
George Washington established precedents that most every president since has followed. But more importantly, the man who was a hero before he became president bestowed credibility and stability upon the new executive branch. He held things together, then gave up power, before leaving for posterity warnings about the fragility of our republic that resonate today. That's next with Alexis Coe as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
He was concerned with what he would have called factionalism. And factionalism was something that he had tried to avoid by being the only president to this day to have gone into office without declaring a political party. He declared it in many, many other ways, though. He was concerned that people would lose the ability to compromise, and that in pursuit of their end goals, they would do whatever it takes.
Of all the precedents established by George Washington during his 2 terms as president, maybe the most important was the reason we're not talking about 3 or 4 Washington terms. He gave up power when he probably could have remained president for as long as he wanted. And by doing so, he set the stage for the country's first contested presidential election. And another indispensable American tradition, the peaceful transfer of power. Well, it was nice while it lasted, right?
Who hides evidence? Criminals hide evidence, not honest people. So, over the next 10 days, we get to see the machines that are crooked, the ballots that are fraudulent, and if we're wrong, we will be made fools of. But if we're right, a lot of them will go to jail. So, let's have trial by combat.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing, and stolen by the fake news media. That's what they've done and what they're doing. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. Our country has had enough. We will not take it anymore, and that's what this is all about.
Multiple capital entries! Multiple capital entries!
Political extremism, hyperpartisanship, demagoguery, defined as political activity or practices that seek support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people, rather than by using rational argument. It's all as bad as it's ever been in my short lifetime, anyway. Our divided society, where no issue, no matter how trivial, is immune from rank tribalism, even draws comparisons to the 1850s. A Pew Research Center poll taken last year found that increasing percentages of Republicans and Democrats view not just the opposing party, but the people in that party in a negative light. 72% of Republicans regard Democrats as more immoral than other Americans. 63% of Democrats say the same about Republicans. This is no surprise, of course. If you spend any time on Twitter or listen to cable TV or talk radio, you know that each side accuses the other of trying to destroy the country. Now, George Washington may not have been looking 200 years into the future when he penned his farewell address, with some help from Hamilton and Madison, but it reads like he was. Our founders were students of history, and they knew republics failed. They knew that a large republic such as ours could be riven by regional jealousies. and they feared swoonish public opinion could be manipulated by a demagogue, leaving the young nation vulnerable to malign foreign influence.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
Whatever you think of the Russia investigation, has any major party candidate in American history ever asked a foreign power, a hostile foreign power, to interfere with one of our elections? In his farewell address, Washington repeatedly warns of the dangers of factionalism and party. He wrote, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual." Well, maybe I am putting too modern a spin on 18th century prose, but no one can deny that hyper-partisanship is tearing at the fabric of our republic today. Although at the same time, many Americans will say they're tired of it, or maybe they're just tired of their opponent's partisanship. And it doesn't look like this fever is going to break anytime soon, as House Republicans are now talking about opening an impeachment inquiry into President Biden. Here is House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
Which provides Congress the strongest power to get the rest of the knowledge and information needed. Because this president has also used something we have not seen since Richard Nixon, used the weaponization of government to benefit his family and deny Congress the ability to have the oversight.
And that was Speaker McCarthy on Hannity on Fox News in an interview about the Hunter Biden investigation. As Alexis Coe put it in an essay for Smithsonian Magazine, Washington couldn't predict the future, but a half-century of public service left him with enough wisdom to fashion a shockingly modern document, referring to his farewell address. And a few weeks ago on Twitter, I noticed Alexis mention that she's been reading the farewell address over and over again, so I thought, why not talk about it here? Alexis Coe is a historian and author whose short biography of George Washington, You Never Forget Your First, was a New York Times bestseller. She is a fellow at New America, and her project there is a series of public conversations exploring Americans' views of this question: how should a president be? Alexis Coe, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Very excited to have you here. I just finished reading your book a few days ago. But first, something a little bit more recent, because your book's been out for, about a couple of years already, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go a little bit more recent. You wrote an essay just now in Smithsonian Magazine about George Washington's farewell address. But I noticed a comment you made on Twitter, or I guess it's called X now.
God, yes.
That you read and reread the farewell address. Why is that?
I read it quite often, and that's as surprising to me as it probably was to you to read it. I didn't think that I would when I was writing the book. This is something that has happened over the last 4 years or so. So, towards the end of the book, after I turned it in, it is a wildly modern document for George Washington. I get the sympathy of a lot of my fellow scholars in the founding era. John Adams scholar once said to me, but he's so vanilla. And I get that, but he has these moments. And when he has these moments, I like to embrace them. The farewell address, he gets really specific about his vision. He speaks about things that do feel quite modern, not that he was some sort of superhuman who could see into the future and understood our world, but that there are fundamental problems that exist in the world and that the country has been faced with since the very beginning. And we are a young country, so they haven't changed that much.
And problems that, wouldn't you say, are inherent to democracies or a republic? I mean, just the fact that they were trying to found a republic at all.
Washington was not a Pollyannish thinker. He was a reluctant revolutionary, as I call him in my book. It took decades of writing, as he called them, polite letters to London and trying to negotiate with England. He thought that there was a way to work things out. And then when there wasn't, he understood it. I think that he, however, underestimated the power, the unifying power, not of George Washington. I don't think he was a really egotistical guy, but a little bit. He overestimated the unifying power of the revolution. And he was also, you have to remember, a general, and he was a enslaver, so a master. Those were his foundational formative roles. He's used to doling out orders and expecting people, even when he asked for their opinion, to then accept whatever his resolution is. And so factionalism for him was overwhelming because it was this push and pull of democracy that he didn't totally understand. We had no model. He just would sometimes think that his word was bond.
Yeah, this freewheeling political world of the newspapers in those days and the pamphlets, this was something he really wasn't used to. All the criticism he took, especially in his second term as president, right?
He's so sensitive. I mean, really, really sensitive in a way that you would not expect. Jefferson said that he was one of the most sensitive people he's ever met. But of course, Jefferson was penning or, encouraging others to pen some of these critical essays. He was getting older. He felt like he had really sacrificed, and he had, but particularly for the presidency, he did not want it. And he expected people to give him a certain amount of reverence that he did not feel coming, which I think is a really good thing for us to remember when it comes to what one can and can't say about the president. It was always, from the very beginning, a divisive position, even with the great unifier, someone we revere and have the collective we for our entirety.
Yeah, I had not read the farewell address for, I don't know how many years, until I read it from start to finish a couple of different times last year when I actually went to Mount Vernon and I met the president there, and Joseph Ellis joined us for a podcast episode or two. It's a dense, I don't know if dense is the right way of putting it. There's a lot in there. It's not a short speech that you can just read in 5 minutes. Although
it's 6,000 words.
Yeah, he did not deliver it as a speech though, right?
He didn't. He did not like going before Congress. He went before Congress initially to talk to them about the Creeks, and a treaty was being negotiated. It was one of the first matters of business in government. And that is what the Constitution told him to do. He could either go in front of Congress to get advice, or he could go and write to the heads of his departments. And he did not get what he wanted. He left. He said, "I'm never returning," and he did it. He didn't love to speak in general in public. This is true for his entire life, but certainly as time went on and he had fewer and fewer teeth, he really didn't like to do so. And when he was inaugurated, he only had one tooth left. And of course, he wore dentures. And I think now, as most of us know, they were made of, at best, he was a poacher, and at worst, enslaved people who worked for him. This was not specific to him. It was not some sort of fetish that he had. This was what the elite did in early America. But he also was self-conscious about what he called his deficient education. Jefferson, Adams, Monroe, Madison, they had all been to the best schools. They had been educated by people. They had orated. They'd spent long amounts of time living in Europe. Washington had not. He went abroad once to the Bahamas. And so we have a man who is American to his core and so sensitive, so self-conscious, but yet has this magnetism. We really can't underestimate what it was like. Quite often when people struggle to understand what he was like because we don't have any sort of moving visual for him, I say just imagine an athlete. Imagine one of those people you see running across the field who are so graceful and you think, I get it. That's what Washington was like.
I want to return to the substance of the farewell address in a moment, but I just want to raise an issue that I've raised with other historians of the early period, and that is why we today keep going back to our founders for guidance or wisdom, or often sometimes to find support for our favorite policies today, right? These were, as you mentioned, they were pre-modern, pre-Darwin, pre-industrial men who sometimes are dismissed as just slave-holding elites, or at the other end of that spectrum, demigods who can't do anything wrong. And I have arrived at not a very profound answer at all. It's a simple one. We're still living in the political framework that they created. Of course, much has changed since the late 1700s. We had a civil war. We had the Great Depression, World War II, where the United States emerges as a global superpower. I mean, that's something that they could not have imagined in the late 18th century. But I guess that it comes down to that. We were a republic, and as students of history, the founders understood that republics failed. And I think you see some of that concern coming out in the speech.
Absolutely. We launched an age of revolutions. Ours, however, was not bloody. There was consistency in government. So much of that was George Washington's forethought, which he did not get as much credit for as I think that he should have, which is why in my book, I don't focus on the battles, which was kind of a risky move. They've been well covered. I list them, but I want to give him credit for public opinion, which was important, and for stability. He wanted other nations to feel like they could trade with us. Other nations who had had bloodier revolutions did not get that kind of trust, certainly not in the earliest stages. I agree with you to a certain extent. I deal a lot with, on Twitter, in person, wherever, the two extremes. People come at me. I really can't win sometimes. Certain people come at me and they say, George Washington owned slaves, and I don't want to study him. I don't want anything to do with him. And I wish them the best of luck because, first of all, are you going to go into a fight unarmed? You should know everything. And you do not have to study him as a role model, as your personal hero. That is not why he's in our textbooks. He is historically significant. And it seems to me, I don't even want to say a missed opportunity. It seems to me profoundly, and I don't use this word very often, stupid to ignore that information. At the other end of the spectrum, the people who are up in arms that George Washington is going to be canceled, best of luck. It's never going to happen. He is essential to our founding story. If his name is taken off a building, he'll be okay. We still need to understand him. What I think is most frustrating is the inability for people to hold two things at once. We love our origin story the way we love the story of how our parents met. It's our family story. It's our country's story. But with those people, we tend to be able to understand the duality of them far better than we do our founders. We can take what we want, we can leave the rest behind. And that is what I would love for us to start to work on as a country.
George Washington has more claims to historical significance than slaveholding. He was not Jefferson Davis or any of the Confederates who still have statues up in some parts of the country. Their only claim to historical significance is enslavement and secession and civil war and treason. George Washington is not in that same category. So about the speech, he talks about a few things that he believes are threats to our republic. What was he talking about here? I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. He goes on to say it is inseparable, this spirit, from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy.
He was concerned with what he would have called factionalism. And factionalism was something that he had tried to avoid by being the only president to this day to have gone into office without declaring a political party. He declared it in many, many other ways, though. He was concerned that people would lose the ability to compromise, and that in pursuit of their end goals, they would do whatever it takes to make that happen. And once you do that, once you decide that the end goal justified the means, you lost all your principles. And so he called these people unprincipled men. And who takes advantage of unprincipled men? Manipulative despots, dictators, strong men. And once that happens, it's over. Once those people go into office, they rarely come out in anything other than a body bag.
There was a real concern in those days of an American president coming under the influence of a foreign country.
At the same time, though, it was a tricky situation. As soon as Washington took his second inauguration, France declares war on Great Britain. And we have to decide what to do. And Jefferson, despite being a sort of infamous Francophile, decides that we should go to the highest bidder. Now, that is a bad idea as well. Washington, again, was really concerned about how vulnerable any sort of association would make us. If you are fighting other people's war, or if you are fighting other people's interests, you do not have the flexibility you need to respond to the needs of your electorate, which at the time looked very different than ours. Any sort of relationship that could not change, that was inviolable, made it risky, because that's what we had done as colonists, right? We had to do whatever the British, and this collectively, we had to do whatever the British told us to. We had to pay whatever taxes, we had to fight whatever wars. That becomes very expensive and never ending. America as a new country was not embroiled in these conflicts that had gone on for hundreds of years. France declaring war on Britain, that had happened many, many times.
In Washington, you said he wasn't a member of a party. I mean, political parties were primitive in those days, but the idea of factionalism, and he was a Federalist, capital F Federalist, he wasn't just railing against partisanship in general. He was talking about partisanship directed at him specifically. He wasn't very happy with all the criticism he had received.
No, I mean, he created the cabinet thinking it would be like his council of war during the American Revolution. He would gather great minds together, they would fight it out, and he would decide what to do. Then they would leave and they would be mum. That's not what happened. Jefferson would later describe it like a cockfight. And when I read that, everything suddenly made sense, right? You have a fight to the death, and Washington is there sort of presiding over this bloodbath. It didn't feel that way to him. So he was absolutely shocked to read about this criticism, to know that this was being read aloud in pubs and meeting places. He was very surprised by that.
Well, Jefferson, who I happen to admire a great deal, despite some problems with his record as well, of course, but Jefferson was running or leading what you might call the first opposition movement or party in the country while he was a member of Washington's administration. It's really crazy.
And denying it to a certain extent. You know, Hamilton kept, because Hamilton and Jefferson were like oil and water from the very beginning. You know, they hadn't met for some time. And then when America was actually a country, it was not a great friendship. They respected each other, but they were not friends. And he was very, very sensitive to it. And to read those words were painful to him.
The farewell address's admonition against permanent alliances, not entangling alliances. I don't know how that one, people got that one confused for a while. Washington did not coin that term. He said permanent alliances. I think it was Jefferson who said entangling. Anyway, about the alliances, it does seem a bit dated or difficult to draw useful lessons from there, considering the modern alliance system that the United States has been a part of and has led in. But what was Washington concerned about there? You mentioned it a little bit before about how Europe, constant wars, bankrupting countries, getting them in trouble. I guess he thought the United States was too fragile at that point.
He thought it was too fragile. We simply lacked the infrastructure to participate in something like that economically, militarily. We were not quite as established as we like to think of ourselves as. And Washington called us an infant nation. And I really think that that's why he took the presidency. He was like a mother. He had carried us to term and then needed to sort of be there our first couple of years to make sure that we could survive. When Washington tried to compromise with someone like Jefferson, who was opposed to many of his foundational views about American government, things went wrong in his mind. So he starts off with a cabinet that has members who agree with him and members who do not. After the first term, it does not look like that. And one of the reasons is because he had listened to Jefferson to allow an ambassador, Genet, to come to America. And Genet was supposed to dock, come see Washington, normal stuff. That's not what happened. Genet went around all the country trying to get people excited about supporting the French, which, by the way, the French played a decisive role in our victory, of course, at Yorktown and in the Revolution. So it was not out of left field for them to ask us to do this. Washington felt really threatened by that, and he felt incredibly disrespected. And that was not something he had ever dealt with well. When he was a young man fighting for the British, it was one of his greatest insults that he was not promoted, that he was not respected. To do this as he's president, when he had agreed to something, knowing it would be risky, was not a matter of diplomacy. It was personal.
Hard to blame him there. As you say, Genet comes over from France, and he's essentially lobbying the country, going on a publicity tour to try to dictate what America's foreign policy should be. So, yeah. So Washington dies about a century before the big public debate over whether the U.S. should control non-contiguous territory, our first overseas empire, if you will, Spanish-American War. But Washington believed in empire, right, insofar as he saw North America, the continent, as an empire for British settlement. Washington's relationship with slavery gets a lot of attention. What about Native Americans?
It's a really good question. Washington had a name that Indians gave him, which was Town Destroyer. Washington was land hungry. It's one of his defining features that does not get enough attention. His will is illuminating to me, as illuminating as the farewell address. It has his hand. He could have gone to a lawyer, just like he could have, had Hamilton write the entire farewell address, but he's actually putting himself in it. And Washington, we know from his will, was one of the largest landholders in America. So he believed that it was not only the way for him to gain personal wealth, but for the country to succeed. This was an agrarian society. So what do you need the most? You need land. So he was all for accruing land. However, he understood the limitations of a country.
Speculator too, right? Sorry.
Yes, he was a speculator. He got his first job as a surveyor, and that's how he acquired quite a bit of land. So he understood the value in it.
So about your book, what inspired you to write a book about someone who's been written about a gazillion times? And the title, I know you've been asked these questions before, but not everyone listens to every interview. Your title, You Never Forget Your First, as opposed to, George Washington, father of our country.
Right, hero of the revolution, something to do with destiny. Those are the usual titles. I am a political historian. At least that's what I was when I decided to write this book. And I was hosting a podcast for Audible called Presidents Are People Too. The way that I prepared for this podcast was the way I prepared in grad school for things. You read that were outside of your expertise. You read 4 or 5 books, and you could sort of enter into the conversation. People disagreed. You understood stakeholders. That did not happen with Washington. That is the only president thus far I have ever studied who has more than one biography, which not all have, who had that sort of unanimous approach. And I wrote an email to my agent. Sure that he would say no, because he often did. And the subject to get his attention was, you never forget your first. And in the body of the book, I addressed your question, which I never get tired of. If I told you, you can't tell me that Washington was the president, that he was the hero of the revolution, wooden teeth, any of those things. What can you tell me about Washington? What can you quote? What can you talk about at length? If it's nothing, we need another book. And we needed another book.
That's interesting because I actually hadn't read a cradle-to-grave biography of George Washington in a long time until I prepared for my chat with Joseph Ellis last year. I mentioned how I went to Mount Vernon, and I read Joseph Ellis's short biography of Washington, which is not about his entire life either. That's just about certain important chapters in it. Ellis's book was excellent. But yeah, it occurred to me that, I don't really know that much about the personal side of Washington. I don't read a lot of biography in general, although I read a lot of history. I tend to read more contextual stuff. Like most people, I've read plenty about George Washington vis-a-vis the Revolutionary War and his presidency. But yeah, not the personal stuff. And I actually found the most interesting part of your book to be the dynamic between him and his mother. You rescue Mary Washington from what past historians have done to her. Can you talk about that a little bit?
This was a part of my realization that, oh no, I have to write a book on George Washington. I, as any good historian, would read something in one book and then the other book and then the next book, and noticed that they were iterations of the same thing, quoting the same source, but it was sort of like watching Pinocchio's nose grow. This perhaps sort of predates and led to me writing Washington biography. I was a curator at the NYPL, and we had Parson Weems's different editions of his biography on George Washington. And the Cherry Tree story does not appear in the first, second, third edition. And then when it does, my goodness, does it grow and grow and grow. What was really interesting to me about that was you couldn't check the sources, right? He was on the ground. And when I would go to check the sources from other people like Ellis and particularly Ron Chernow, who I'm very grateful to for Hamilton, as we all are, and popularizing the revolution, I did not see what they were saying reflected in the primary source. And with Mary Washington, it was absolutely undeniable. Ron Chernow said that Mary Washington was illiterate. And in grad school, years earlier, I had visited Mount Vernon and seen her hand. I had seen letters in her hand. I had seen annotations. And I thought, okay, either he's getting this wrong or this is a class-based judgment. Let me go from here. And then the more I dug, the more I felt like a lot of it was inaccurate. There was no curiosity. Everyone just wanted their own beautiful, in their eyes, beautiful sentence on the same event that someone else had written before them. And they would often quote themselves. You know, Ron Chernow, if you follow his endnotes, is usually citing himself. And that is something you do not do. You're taught not to do in grad school. And so that was overwhelming to me. But the language he used in particular, he would call her things like crusty. And I just can't imagine calling a subject that. I can't imagine. So I have a chart in the introduction because it was a lot to take in, and I really wanted people to understand the shorthand of it rather than having to read all the biographies.
Yeah, I was just trying to flip through the beginning of the book to find this one anecdote, but I'll have you, you can tell me right here. I don't know, there's some incident where Washington has to explain something, or he has to stay home when he wanted to leave, and Chernow blames it on Mary Washington, who shows up in a huff or acting like a shrew or something like that.
A bat out of hell, he says. Washington was thwarted. His mother shows up like a bat out of hell. And then Washington, a young man, can't get to see Governor Dinwiddie to talk to him about, you know, the Virginia militia. That is not what Washington's letter says. It simply says that my mother and several other people, including his cousin and a brother and so on, arrived and they delayed him. Not a big deal. And in fact, Washington was using that as an excuse because he was just late getting on the road. Why wouldn't you just say that? I know that it's difficult, as I mentioned earlier when we were speaking, that I get the sympathies of other scholars, of other founding fathers, because they have a little bit livelier archives. That doesn't mean that we have license to make things up. It's our job as a biographer, and one that I am going to say that I succeeded in, I'm quite proud of, to make the subject interesting, but you do not invent things.
Mary Washington was an impressive woman. You try to place her in her context as a mid-18th century mother dealing with all the issues women had to deal with in those days, right? Who was also primarily concerned with the survival of her kids because people died all the time of everything in those days.
I don't know why we do not talk more about Washington as the grandson of an indentured servant. That is an amazing family story, an amazing origin story, and an amazing American story that would actually complicate our conversations about slavery and would help us understand a little bit better, just a little bit, what was going on in his head. Mary Washington was a widow and she was a single mother. And I wrote this book before I was any of those things, but I understand it even more now. In early America, she had no rights. She couldn't show up in court. She couldn't technically negotiate with any sort of merchant. Unlike Martha Washington, who was widowed before, when Washington met her, she was a widow, but she was a femme sole, meaning that she had complete control. Mary did not. If she remarried, her children and everything that they owned, which wasn't a lot, could be taken away. And so what she did was she made a decision that she would not remarry, that she would take care of Washington and his many younger siblings and ensure that they had the best life possible. And when we look at her success rate, it's off the charts. We think, okay, Washington, sure, he was a big deal, but she also married off her other children, and they did quite well. Particularly her daughter married the wealthiest family in town. That, to her, was a great success.
What I thought was the most provocative part of your book is it's a short section about Washington's sex life, actually, before he got married. There's some speculation, and this is just speculation, that he may have sexually exploited an enslaved woman. What can you tell us about that?
We don't actually know if any of that is true. We know that he didn't respond to provocative letters that were sent to him by other people. We can't point to any heirs from Washington directly because he was sterile. If anything happened, it would be before he was 18, but we haven't heard anything about it. Nothing has been substantiated. There's plenty of evidence to suggest his stepson and step-grandson and brother and other people had non-consensual sex with people they enslaved or other people enslaved. But we don't see that from Washington, and I think that's really interesting. But I don't say that he had any sort of affair with anyone outside of Martha Washington. And in fact, I'm really doubtful of quite a few of the rumors and other sort of, I almost call it, you tick boxes with Washington, right? You have to say that he did this and he did that, and he had a crush on his, half-brother's friend's wife, and that he may have had an affair. I don't actually see evidence to suggest that he had more than just the basic crushes we all have when we're younger.
Yeah, I mean, his private life has always been somewhat opaque to me, unlike, say, Thomas Jefferson, whose private
Sure.
life. And part of that is because letters, right? Washington's letters to his wife don't survive except for a handful.
I would do the same thing. I would burn them all. However, I do not appreciate that Martha and George did. I would have loved to have known things. The good news is sometimes things are trapped in a desk drawer. And so we know just a little bit about how they talk to each other. We know that he called her Patsy, which was the huge revelation. It's small, but if you think about it, it is a intimate moment between them to have learned about. And we can judge other things about their life. We can look at how much Washington wanted Martha with him. We can look at what Martha did that she was so uncomfortable with during her life married to him. She would travel. She would get inoculated. These are things she did not want to do. But we don't know that much about them. We do, however, know that Washington was on the hunt for a rich bride. I often joke that any wealthy 14-year-old in Virginia, Washington wrote to her father.
And we'll close with this. Something I find sad about the Washington story is that after all he did for the country, and he did sacrifice a lot. Yes, he was very wealthy and owned a lot of property, and compared to most people, he had a fairly comfortable life. But his retirement was brief, not very happy, and then he dies of... Well, after, as you say in your book, he survived so many different ailments and diseases over the course of his life. He dies from something that, well, today would not kill you because there are drugstores down the street. So he had a very short and seemingly not very happy retirement.
It was not very happy, although I think he enjoyed certain parts of it. He's an industrious, arduous worker. So things that we might not enjoy, he loved. He had a long to-do list. And when he died, it was the result, we think, of, a common cold that got out of control because he insisted on riding out, checking on these trees that were being planted, then wouldn't change his clothes because he didn't want to be late for lunch. But he sat there in wet clothes. And then, the worst thing anyone could do for you in early America was call a doctor. The doctor was rarely just a doctor. They were often a barber, an overseer, or whatever it was. So he was sort of tortured. I think he was happy, but I think he also felt overwhelmed and cranky. Congress had waived postage starting after the revolution, so he had tons of mail. He was mad that they didn't pay for him to respond to all this mail. People just showed up all the time. Everyone wanted favors. It was a lot for someone who really prized quiet time.
Yeah, and it was getting at there was in the fall of 1798, when, again, he should just be chilling out and enjoying his retirement. John Adams appoints him to be commander-in-chief again to deal with a possible invasion from France that never materializes. This is the so-called quasi-war. This was kind of a sad and embarrassing chapter at the end of Washington's military career, if you will.
Washington was almost always going to respond to what he believed was his patriotic duty, but he didn't believe in any of it. He wasn't excited to serve Adams. He wasn't excited to lead a military. And we have to remember that he had been very aware of his limitations at that point. Before the presidency, Washington could go into any situation and kind of master it, right? So Washington had a very short military career before he led the Continental Army against lifelong generals. And there's a great quote, I'll muddle, from Franklin, where he says, Washington sent your generals back to you one after the other with their laurels, I think sagging on their head. But when Washington got to office, he realized how he could be really overwhelmed by a role and by the demands. So it was a very sad time. I think had this actually happened, I'm not quite sure he wouldn't have just been sort of propped up by Hamilton.
And I'll say this, one image that has stayed in my head since I read your book, George Washington with one tooth in his mouth. Gosh.
But remember, at the time he had a sumptuous suit made of velvet. So you have to remember that while he had one tooth, he had diamond buckles on his shoes.
Well, he wasn't alone in losing all of his teeth, but I guess that's why he never smiled in those portraits.
He did not smile in those portraits. He did have a good sense of humor, though, and it comes out once in a while. He liked to poke fun at people. He made a joke about this, a death mask that Martha insisted he had made. And, he's having all these funny reactions as his face is being smothered. He could have good humor, and then he could be humorless. And that is very present the night before he takes to bed officially. Tobias Lear, who was his personal secretary, who married into his family, was reading the paper to him and Martha, and it was good news for Jefferson and Madison, so he just starts railing against, partisanship and Democratic Republicans, and it's not a good look, and you can tell that at the time because Martha goes to bed. She wants nothing to do with it anymore. Tobias Lear begs him to stop. So I think that really shows how much Washington had sort of lost control of things. You wouldn't hear an account and we don't have accounts like that from earlier.
Yeah, he prided himself on being able to control his passions, is how they put it in those days. Well,
yes, which maybe speaks to your earlier question. He learned to control many of his passions, whether it was his temper or otherwise.
Well, he is smiling ever so slightly on the cover of your book. You never forget your first. Alexis Coe, thank you.
Thank you.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, what's up with Russia and Cuba? No, we're not going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Jeremy Suri will join us next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.